So now we are going to talk about React life cycles. Okay, just to keep this session as simple as possible to understand the basics of life cycle, I have copied few methods in my clipboard and I'm pasting them here. Okay, so the methods are component did mount, component did update, should component update, and component will unmount. Okay, so and I'm going to tell you the order in which all of them are going to execute. Okay, so let's say first we have the component did mount. So this method gets called whenever React has completely rendered or created the DOM element in the browser for this particular class. Okay, so once for this class the entire render method has executed completely, then component did mount will get called. Okay, and when we update something in the UI, okay, for example, when we are updating the state, then it internally invokes the render method. Okay, after it calls the render, it will call the component did update. This happens only when the state has been updated. Okay, and then we have should component update. Okay, this is a boolean function. It is supposed to return a boolean, return true. Okay, by default this will always return true. Okay, and the use of this method is to determine if render should be called or not, especially after the component did update method has been invoked. Okay, just to understand it better, I'm giving another scenario. When we are clicking on that increment button, we are calling this set state method, okay, inside do increment method, and this will internally call render. But here is the catch. When we call the set state method, it will first call should component update. If this method, if should component update method returns false, then it will not call render. Okay, I'm hard coding this to false. I'm saving it. Okay, I'm going back to the browser. I'm clearing it. See, we already have a render called. I'm clearing this. Okay, now when I click on increment, see, nothing happens. Okay, just to understand it better, inside the should component update, I'm adding another console.log. Okay, and I'm printing here should component update called. Okay, I'm saving this. Coming back, clearing the console. Let me zoom in this console so that we can easily read the output here. Okay, let's zoom in a bit more. Okay, clear this. Now when I click on increment, see, it printed should component update called, but it did not call the render. Okay, now I'm coming back to the code and I'm returning true. Okay, I save the code, coming back to the browser, clearing the existing messages, and now I'm clearing on increment. See, should component update has been called and it also printed render. Okay, coming back to the code. So now we have seen when should component update method gets called. Okay, now I'm going to show you when component did mount gets called, as I already have explained. Okay, this method gets called whenever the component has mounted successfully, especially the first time. This gets called only for the first time the component loads. Okay, I'm saving this, Coming back to the browser, I'm clearing the existing message. Oh, sorry, I think I have to reload the page because this executes only one time, and especially when the browser has loaded. When I reload the browser, see, render called, and then it printed component did mount called. Okay. Now, if I click on this increment, this will not get called at all. Increment, see, component did mount called, did not call again, but it called should component update and render. Okay. So component did mount will get called only for the first time when this UI is being created in the browser. Okay, this is a one-time method call. And then we have the component did update. Okay. So this is an invalid body. Okay. So component did update gets called whenever we have returned true. Okay. Or there is another situation where this gets called whenever we have not defined this should component update method, or whenever we have not overridden the should component update method. Then by default it will return true, and then this will get called only when the state has been updated. Okay, inside this component did update, I'm going to again print the message console.log, and I'm going to print the message component did update called. Let's save this. Okay, and let's go back to the browser. We are in the browser now, and I'm going to clear this console, and I'm going to click on increment. Okay, clicked. See, component did update called. Okay, now see the sequence in which this has executed. First, it printed should component update called. This is a Boolean function from where we have returned a Boolean value true. Okay, based on the Boolean value, it has called the render method. Now inside render method, we have printed this message render called. Okay, after this render method execution, it has called the component did update method. Okay, see the sequence. Okay, now just to understand it better, okay, I'm reloading the UI, okay, just to see in what sequence the overall lifecycle methods has been called. I'm reloading it. Okay, now first and foremost, it has called the render. Okay, immediately after that, it called component did mount. Okay, and then I'm clicking on this increment button, and now we have should component update called. Okay, then again it called render, and then it called component did update. See, component did mount was called only once. Okay, that's the whole point of calling this method. It has to execute only one time while loading the component. Okay, and then component did update gets called every time we update the state. Okay, coming back to the code. Then we have component will unmount. Okay, I'm coming this method to in few more minutes. Okay, before that I want to cover another scenario. Okay, we have seen that how these methods can be useful. Okay, and now I want to try out another scenario where the data that is coming from its parent, okay, changes it. So here what I'm trying to say is we are receiving counter props. Okay, if we go above and we see that counter props is having a value of 10. Okay, and this same value we are initializing in state. Okay, Now I want to see how it behaves when I change this value when the UI has been rendered. Okay, let's try that. Here I'm going to create a type, and that type is going to be class example state, and this has a value initial value, and I'm going to define its type as number again. Okay, and I'm passing this as a state for the class example class example state. The moment we have passed this one, we should call the constructor, and I'm passing the props as any because that's the props type we have initialized with, and then I'm calling super and I'm passing the props, and my TypeScript compiler is happy, and after that I'm initializing the state. Okay, notice here I'm not calling this dot set state, I'm initializing it with this dot state equals the object initial value, and I'm starting with let's say 10, or just for a change I'm starting with 20. Okay, now in this I want to have a little more change in structure. Okay, I want to have a div. Inside div I need to have another div just to have a better layering, and inside this div I'm pasting the counter, and then I'm having another div here, but inside this div I'm going to create a button, and I'm going to name this button as reinitialize. Okay, and the value that we are passing here, instead of passing a hard-coded value, I want to pass this dot state dot initial value. Okay, so what we are trying to do here is the parameter that we are sending to this counter component, we are directly sending the state value of class example. Okay, so since we have a button, we need an action handler for this. Okay, so I'm going to name this button handler as reinitialize handler. Okay, and inside this I'm going to update the state. Okay, and as we already have seen earlier how to update the state, so that's what I'm doing now, and it has an initial value, and the initial value I'm going to use here is +5. Okay, so what I'm doing here is every time we click on this reinitialize button, this will reinitialize, or this will update this state value, initial value, with 5 numbers incremented. Okay, and in order to link this method to this button, we have to add the onClick handler, this dot reinitialize handler. And since we already have seen, in order to use methods inside, in order to use state inside the methods, we should use this dot reinitialize handler equals this dot reinitialize handler dot bind of this. Now we should be able to use this. Let's see how it looks in the UI. Okay, see, we have two big buttons. First one is the increment and next one is the reinitialize. Let's see what happens when we click on this reinitialize. See, should component update called, and then it again called render. Again it called component did update. Okay, I'm clearing this console again. Again I'm clicking reinitialize. Reinitialize. Okay, just the way we saw last time, whenever we were clicking on this increment, it was internally calling should component update method first. Okay, then it called render, and then it called component did update. Okay, the exact same thing happened with reinitialize, but this time it did not happen due to change in the state. This time it happened due to change in the props. Okay, you see the difference? So when I'm clicking on the increment, this will update the state, and when I'm clicking on the reinitialize, this will update the props. In both these two cases, it will call the should component update method. If we return true inside this method, then it will call render, and then it will call the component did update. Now I need to make few more changes just to make everything in line. So the change that I want now is to handle this new value that is coming in. Okay, and where exactly I do that? I do that inside component did update. Okay, because in component did update we have the reference of the previous props. So inside this component did update method, okay, I'm going to add few more lines of code. First I'm going to print the previous value of props. Okay, previous initial value was pref props dot val. Okay, this is the value that we were taking from previous props, because using counter props we were receiving the value. Okay, and then I'm going to print current initialized value, and that I'm going to print from this dot props dot val. Okay, because this dot props is going to have the latest props data, and whatever we had in the previous props will have that in the argument of this component did update method. Okay, and now once we have this latest value, we can call this dot set state again. I'm taking the reference of the state, and I'm going to return the new value. I'm sorry, that is going to be state val is this dot props dot val. Okay, so this is what we have done. So what we are doing here, so inside component did update method we are printing two more values. First is going to be the previous initial value, and then we are printing the current initialized value. Previous initialized value is coming from the argument of this method, previous props, and the current initialized value we are going to print it from this dot props dot val. Okay, let's see how this is working. Okay, let's see how it prints the UI. Okay, we have the console messages cleaned, and when I click on reinitialize now, okay, so this has printed an error. Okay, and the reason is it has gone into an infinite loop. Okay, and eventually it threw an error. Okay, coming back to the code, and this is the reason. So inside this component did update method, we were directly calling this dot set state. Okay, and when we do this, this will again internally invoke should component update, and here we are returning true. Okay, then again it will call render, and after calling render it will come back to component did update again. Okay, and then again it will execute this dot set state, and then this loop will continue executing. In order to break this loop, we have to, in fact we must have to give a condition. If this dot props dot val is not equals this dot, sorry, it should be pref props dot val. Only in this case we should execute this piece of code. Okay, saving this and coming back. Okay, this should be double equals. Okay, now the compiler is happy, clearing the console. Now I'm clicking on reinitialize. See what happened. Okay, when we clicked on reinitialize, okay, first it printed, or first it called should component update method. Inside should component update method, we had returned true. So then it went to call render method, and it called the render. After that it called component did update method. Okay, this is the same method where we just now added conditions. Inside this we had printed console messages, previous initial value 20. Okay, and the current initialized value is 25, because that's what we did in that's what we did in class example component, right? We added 5 with the initial value. Okay, after that it called should component update. Okay, and then again it called render. Okay, after calling render, again it called component did update. Okay, but this time our condition did not meet, because the previous value and the current value are not different, they are same. If we go back to our code and see the condition, this dot props dot val is not equals pref props dot val, only in that case this will execute this line of code. Okay, this is where we are breaking the loop. Okay, so that is how we are going to update the component. Okay, so as I said, there are 2 scenarios under which the component did update will get called. Once where we update the state, and the second is when we update the props. Okay, I'm clearing the console and now I'm clicking on the increment. Okay, see, when I call increment, it called should component update called, then it called render, and again it called component did update. Okay, but this time we did not change anything in the previous props or the props value. The props value remain as it is, and that's why it did not update the state for the further executions, and that's where it stops the loop. Okay, clearing the console, coming back to the code. Okay, and now I want to cover another efficient use of the should component update. Okay, so I want to have a condition where this will get called only when the state value and the props values are different. So as we have seen that every time we click on the reinitialize button in class example, okay, we are incrementing 5 with the initial value, and that's the number we are updating in the counter class. Okay, now, okay, in order to implement the should component update for the state and prop values. Okay, so we are going to need two more arguments for this method. They are going to be next props, which is going to be of type counter props, and then we have next state, oops, the spelling, and this is going to be counter state. Okay, and now we are going to have a condition check, and that condition check is going to be if this dot state val not equals next prop dot val, only then call this. Okay, otherwise I'm going to return false, and I'm going to print these things here. Okay, as well as false. Okay, now I'm going to save them, and I'm going to come back to the UI. Okay, clearing the console. Okay, first I'm incrementing this value till 25, and then I'm clearing the console. Okay, and then I'm calling reinitialize. Did you see what happened? Should component update called dash false. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, let's just reinitialize one more time. I clicked on reinitialize, but this time it executed 2 times as we already had seen based on that. Okay, I'm clearing this. Okay, I click on increment again 5 times. Okay, but since we already have this value, now I click on reinitialize. See, it did not execute the remaining methods, since inside the should component update method we are returning false. Okay, and now I'm going to cover the component will unmount. Okay, okay, I'm going to print a message here. Component will unmount. Okay, and this gets called, I mean this method component will unmount will get called whenever this UI is being removed from the browser. Okay, this happens whenever from one screen we are going to another screen, or maybe we are removing this from the DOM element. Okay, in those scenarios this component will unmount method will be called, and we cannot create that kind of scenario within this component. We have to do it from another part of this application. So we can do this inside index.tsx. Okay, so I have copied one line actually, and I'm going to call with that one with, okay, let's use a simple function here. I'm going to paste it here, and I'm going to remove or comment out the existing line. And since we are calling set timeout, I'm going to timeout with say 3 seconds, 3000 milliseconds. Okay, let's go back to, okay, I think we have a compilation issue. React is defined but never used. Okay, never mind. So we can, it's fine, let's just leave it out there because we are going to need it for other examples. I'm going to reload it. Okay, class example is defined but never used. Okay, okay, I think I have to, okay, I have okay, now let's save this. Okay, coming back to the screen, see, it just disappeared, and it again called component will unmount. Okay, let me add some more time just to see it with some time in hand. I have it at 10 seconds. Okay, so anytime in 10 seconds this entire DOM is going to be removed. Okay, wait, that's it, component will unmount. Okay, so these are the very important life cycle methods we would be using, or we should be using, while creating React components. We have to use these methods in the best possible way. So these are the methods: component did mount, component did update, should component update, and component will unmount. Okay, apart from these 4 lifecycle methods, there are other lifecycle methods as well, but they are not as critical or as important as these. And in fact, there are few lifecycle methods which have been deprecated recently. So, and I don't want to discuss those things because that does not make any sense for the future development of React components. Okay, and just to reiterate how exactly this whole sequence is going to execute, first and foremost, whenever a component is being created, first and foremost is its constructor is going to be called, since we are using TypeScript, and this constructor is not part of the React component. It's mostly part of the TypeScript class. Okay, but since we are using TypeScript class, so this constructor has to execute. First it will call the constructor. Okay, and right after that it will call render. Okay, once render is complete, then it will call the component did mount. Okay, now during the process, if the user updates the state, okay, just the way we have done in do increment method here, okay, updates the state, then immediately first it will call should component update. Okay, now inside this method we should decide whether we need to update the state or not. Okay, so if we don't need to update the state based on the critical conditions we have set, so it will return a false and it will not execute further steps. React will completely ignore that. In case where we need to update the UI, okay, then we should return the true. Okay, and once we return the true, okay, then it is going to call the render. Okay, and again after finishing render, it is going to call component did update. Okay, and should component update will get also called when we have changes in the props. Okay, as we have seen already that inside this class example, on clicking this reinitialize button, okay, it was updating the props, and as the props has changed, okay, this counter component, its props also has changed. Okay, and that's when it also called the should component update. Okay, and finally when we are deleting or when we are removing this UI from the DOM or from the browser, then component will unmount get called. Okay, so I hope you have understood the whole process of using the life cycle. Okay, if you still have any questions, please feel free to post a comment or post your questions on the comments. Okay, see you in the next section.